The last thing I remember before the darkness is the smell of night-blooming jasmine on Cedarwood Lane. I had walked that street every Tuesday evening for 11 years, past Mrs. Fontaine's porch light, past the Delacroix twins' bicycles left sideways on the lawn, past the oak tree with the initials carved into it that nobody ever claimed. I knew that street the way I knew my own breathing, without having to think about it. That evening was no different. Prayer meeting had run a few minutes long because Sister Odessa wanted to close with an extra chorus, and nobody tells Sister Odessa no. I had my cardigan buttoned against the April cool, my Bible tucked under my arm, and my mind moving through the quiet the way it always does after Tuesday evenings. That particular peace that only comes from an hour of giving your burdens somewhere better to sit. My name is Nerissa Brightwell. I am 63 years old, a retired schoolteacher, a mother, and a woman who has spent her whole life believing that if you handle things with care and faith and patience, the truth has a way of finding the surface on its own. I was in the middle of revising that belief. My son Tony had asked me for 2 weeks. 2 weeks before I did anything, said anything, moved on what I had found. He needed time to think, he said. Time to be sure. I loved him enough to say yes, even though every instinct I carried told me 2 weeks was 2 weeks too long. Some things don't wait for you to be ready. They move on their own schedule. But I agreed. And I was honoring that agreement. Walking home from prayer meeting, trying to give the worry somewhere better to sit alongside everything else I had handed over that evening. Earlier that day, I had dropped something off. An envelope. I won't tell you yet what was inside it or whose hands I left it in. What I will tell you is that I had been careful. What I had put in that envelope had taken me longer to build than I want to say out loud, and I had made certain it was somewhere safe, somewhere that had nothing to do with the people who would have wanted it destroyed. It was safe. I was certain of that. If you are watching this at whatever hour it is where you are, whether it is morning or midnight, drop the time in the comments. I want to know who is sitting with me tonight. I turned onto Cedarwood Lane. The street looked the way it always looked. Mrs. Fontaine's light on. The Delacroix bicycles where they always were. The oak tree with its anonymous initials catching the edge of the streetlight the way it always did. Everything exactly as it should be. I was thinking about the envelope, not with fear, with the particular quiet of a woman who has done the thing that needed doing and set it down correctly. Whatever came next, that piece of it was handled. That piece of it was safe. I was still thinking about it when I saw the headlights. They were not coming from where headlights should come from. That was the first thing. The second thing was that they were not slowing. I had time to think one thought, then nothing. Just the jasmine and the dark. And somewhere in the back of whatever was still working inside me, the knowledge that the envelope was exactly where I had left it. Safe. Whatever they had just done to me, they were already too late. The first thing that came back was light, not sight. I hadn't opened my eyes yet. Just light, pressing through my eyelids in the particular orange-pink way of a room that is too bright and too close. Then smell. Antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those that I recognized immediately as a place where people are held together while their bodies decide which way to go. I knew where I was before I knew anything else. I did not move. Not because I couldn't, I didn't yet know the full answer to that, but because something in the back of my mind that has kept me alive for 63 years said wait. Just wait. Listen first. So I listened. A nurse somewhere to my left, her shoes on the floor, the particular efficient rhythm of someone checking equipment, a television in another room, and then voices, assembling themselves out of the ambient sound, the way voices do when your brain is working its way back to the surface. Tony first. I would know that voice in any condition, in any darkness. He was speaking low and fast the way he does, when he is trying not to fall apart in public and failing at the edges. His grief was unguarded and completely real. The sound of a man who did not know this was coming and has not yet found the floor under his feet. That sound moved through me like something physical. It steadied something. Then Berlinda. I have known Berlinda Covington for 14 years. I know the sound of her actual emotions and I know the sound of her performed ones. What I heard from across that room was a performance, precise, correctly timed, hitting every expected note with the accuracy of someone who had thought about what grief should sound like in this specific room before she arrived in it. The words were right. The music underneath them was wrong. I cataloged my body without moving a muscle. Head, pain concentrated behind my left eye, the specific deep pressure of something that had been rattled hard. Ribs. Breathing cost something it shouldn't cost, at least 2 on the right side. Wrist. Wrong. The angle of it against the sheet was wrong, and the wrong was loud even without touching it. I filed all of it, and I stayed still. Then Damien spoke. He had come in quietly. I hadn't heard his arrival, which told me he had been there longer than he wanted Tony to know. His voice was composed in the way Berlinda's was composed, not the composure of a worried man holding himself together, but the composure of a man who had already decided how he was going to be in this room before he walked into it. He spoke to Tony. Condolences first. Appropriate, warm, exactly calibrated. Then he asked what the doctors had said, whether there had been any change, whether they expected me to wake up soon. The questions were correct. The sequence was correct. Tony answered as best he could, and then Damien asked whether the auto insurance company had been contacted yet, whether a claim had been opened, whether there was a case number, whether investigators had reached out. Nothing unusual on its face. People ask practical questions after accidents every day. But something about the timing caught my attention. The way he arrived there so quickly. The way his voice sharpened almost imperceptibly once the subject changed. Not enough for Tony to hear, just enough for me to notice. I lay completely still. In that moment, I was not operating on strategy. I had no plan for what came next. I had fractured ribs and a broken wrist and a head that was not entirely reliable yet. What I had was 63 years of teaching me to read the room before I responded to it. I kept my eyes closed. Whatever they believed I could not hear, I was about to hear all of it. People reveal themselves in hospital rooms. Not through confessions. People like Berlinda and Damien don't confess anywhere, least of all in rooms with nurses walking in and out. They reveal themselves through the small things. The word choice. The pause in the wrong place. The way a body relaxes when it believes it is no longer being watched. I had nothing to do but notice. Berlinda arrived first on the second morning. I heard her before she reached the door, her particular walk, the soft, decisive click of her heels that she has never learned to quiet, regardless of the setting. She spoke to the nurse in the hallway in the low, warm register of a deeply concerned family friend. The nurse said something reassuring. Berlinda made a sound of grateful relief that was precisely the right length. She came to the bed. Tony was in the chair to my right. She stood over me and touched my hand, her fingers cool, the pressure careful, and said my name twice in the voice of a woman looking at someone she loved and feared losing. The words were exactly right. Then Tony's phone rang and he stepped into the hallway. In the 11 seconds between the door closing behind him and the nurse appearing to check my IV line, Berlinda leaned down close to my ear. Her voice dropped to just above a whisper. She said, "You always had to keep digging, Nerissa." Nothing more. No threat. No explanation. No accusation a reasonable person could point to and call evidence. Just 7 words. Then she straightened before the nurse reached the bed. By the time Tony came back, she was standing at the window with her arms crossed, looking out at the parking lot with the expression of a woman deep in worried thought. I lay completely still and put those 7 words exactly where they needed to go. Damien arrived that afternoon. He shook Tony's hand with both of his, the warm, double grip of a man performing brotherhood, and stood at the foot of my bed for a respectful moment before turning his attention to Tony. His composure was immaculate. If Berlinda's grief was a performance, Damien's was architecture, built, load-bearing, designed to be looked at from every angle without finding a crack. Tony was telling him about the investigation. The police had released minimal information publicly: the incident, the location, a dark-colored SUV, a partial plate that hadn't yet produced a registration. Damien nodded. He asked about the investigation timeline. He asked whether any businesses nearby had security cameras. Then he said, "They'll probably pull footage from that gas station near the intersection." Tony didn't register it. I registered everything. The police had not released any information about nearby businesses. They had not mentioned a gas station. They had not discussed potential camera locations publicly. They had only confirmed the street and the basic circumstances of the incident. The gas station. A small detail. Small enough that most people would have stepped right over it. But details matter because details are what the truth is actually made of. Tony answered without hesitation. "That's what the detective said they're checking." The words left his mouth casually. Damien nodded once, just once. But it was the fraction of a second before the nod that caught my attention. The smallest pause. The brief recalculation of a man discovering he had said slightly more than he intended. I breathed at the same rate I had been breathing. My face did not change. My hand on the blanket did not move. Berlinda looked across the bed at Damien in the moment after he said it. Just a look. A quarter second of eye contact that carried the particular weight of two people checking on each other without appearing to. Tony was looking at the window. When he stepped out again 15 minutes later, both of them sat down. The quality of the air in the room changed immediately, a loosening, an exhale that neither of them spoke out loud, but both of them felt. Two people setting down a weight they had been holding in the upright position. I was 63 years old with fractured ribs and a broken wrist. And I had just heard enough to know I needed to keep listening. Amari came in behind Tony, and he came in differently from every adult who had walked through that door. I felt it before I could explain it. There was no performance in his body. No calibrated expression. No practiced grief, no awareness of how he appeared to the nurses or to anyone else in the room. He was 10 years old, and he walked to my bedside the way a child walks toward the one thing in a room that is anchoring him to the floor. He sat in the chair closest to my head without being asked or directed. Tony settled into the chair further back. Berlinda was already at the window. Amari picked up my hand. Not the way adults hold the hands of unconscious people, carefully, tentatively, with the self-conscious awareness of the gesture. He held it the way children hold things that matter to them. Both of his hands around mine, his thumb moving once across my knuckles and then going still. Tony said something soft to him about being brave. Amari nodded without turning around. His attention was on Berlinda. I could feel the direction of it through the quality of his stillness. When she moved from the window to the foot of the bed, his grip on my hand tightened. Not much, not enough for Tony to notice. Just a fractional increase in pressure that arrived and held. When she spoke, the muscles in his forearm went taut against my wrist. When she left the room briefly to speak with a nurse, his whole body released a breath he had been holding without knowing it. Tony read this as a boy grieving his grandmother. I read it as a boy watching someone he did not trust move around a room that contained someone he loved. There is a difference. Every woman who has ever raised a child knows the difference. The second visit, he was quieter. Whatever he had been carrying when he first came had not been set down. It had gotten heavier. He sat in the same chair, held my hand the same way. But the internal weight of him had shifted. He was somewhere further inside himself. Tony tried twice to draw him into conversation. Both times, Amari answered with the minimum required and returned to wherever he had gone. Berlinda asked him something direct. I couldn't hear the words. She was across the room. And he answered her looking at the floor, not shyly, with the particular careful flatness of a child who has decided what he will and will not give to a specific person. Berlinda smiled at whatever he said and looked at Tony. Tony smiled back. Neither of them saw what I felt in his hand. 20 minutes into the second visit, Tony's phone buzzed and he stepped into the hallway. In the 4 seconds after the door moved, Amari leaned slightly forward. His grip changed, tighter, more deliberate, the grip of someone about to speak rather than someone sitting in silence. His mouth opened. Berlinda walked back in from the small bathroom adjoining the room. Amari sat back. His hand loosened. His face returned to the careful flatness and stayed there for the rest of the visit. When they left, Tony put his hand on Amari's shoulder in the doorway and said something that made Amari nod. Amari glanced back at me once before the door closed. Not the way a child looks at someone they are worried about. The way a child looks at someone they are trying to find the courage to trust. He was 10 years old, and he was carrying something that had no business being inside a 10-year-old's body. Whatever it was, he had almost said it. He would find a way to say it. I was going to make sure of that. Tony stepped out when the doctor appeared at the door. Berlinda had gone to the cafeteria 20 minutes earlier. I had tracked her heels down the hallway until the sound was gone. The nurse had completed her afternoon check and would not return for another 40 minutes by the pattern I had established over 3 days. Amari and I were alone for the first time. I felt him understand it before he moved. The quality of his stillness changed, not relaxing, something more deliberate than relaxing. He turned his head and looked at the door Tony had just pulled closed. Then he got up from his chair. He walked to the door and looked through the narrow window in it. Both ways. A 10-year-old boy checking a hospital corridor the way men check dark parking lots, with the specific alertness of someone who has learned that safety is not a given condition. That image will live inside me until I leave this earth. He came back to the bed. He moved his chair so close that when he sat down, his knees touched the mattress. He picked up my hand and held it in both of his the way he always did. Then he leaned forward until his mouth was close to my ear. He whispered, "Not a clean account, not a timeline or an explanation. A child's fragmented assembly of things witnessed weeks apart, reported in the vocabulary of a boy who had been carrying them alone with no framework for what they meant. Only the weight of knowing they meant something." He told me about the porch steps. 3 weeks before I was hit, he had come home from a friend's house earlier than expected. He sat on the back porch steps in the dark because he could hear his mother on the phone through the screen door, and something in her voice made him stop instead of going in. He didn't understand everything, but he heard a name, and he heard her say, her exact words. He repeated them slowly. "She needs to be handled before she does something with it." He didn't know what it was. He didn't tell me he knew. He just told me what he heard. Then he told me about the kitchen. 5 days later, early morning. He came downstairs for water, and Damien was there. Damien, who had a key he had never seen given, who was in their kitchen at 6:45 in the morning, speaking to his mother in the low, flat register of 2 people finishing a conversation they had been having for a long time. Amari stood in the hallway. He heard Damien say something about needing to be careful, about not making mistakes. He didn't understand what they were talking about. He only remembered the feeling he got standing there listening. Then he heard his mother say, Tony's name. Just the name. The way you say a name when it is the subject of a sentence you don't finish out loud. Amari stopped whispering for a moment. Then he said 3 words directly into my ear, with the particular careful quietness of a child who has been holding something explosive and is finally setting it down. Dad is next. I felt his hands tighten around mine. "I didn't tell Dad," he whispered. He wouldn't. "Believe me." Then he sat back. He kept holding my hand, and he tipped his head back and looked at the ceiling, and he did not say anything else. He had carried it as far as he could carry it. He had set it down, the only place he could find, that felt safe enough. I lay completely still. Inside the stillness, I made him a promise, not out loud, not in words he could hear, but I made it the way you make the promises that actually hold, with every functional part of myself, with the full weight of what I now understood. I was going to get us both out of this, whatever that required, however long it took. I was going to keep this child safe, and I was going to keep his father safe, and I was going to make sure that every person responsible for what had been set in motion answered for it completely. That was the promise. The last visitor left at 8:43. I know the exact time because I had been tracking the ward's rhythm for 4 days, the shift change at 7, the medication round at 8, the particular settling of a hospital floor when the last set of civilian footsteps has moved toward the elevator, and the night belongs to the staff and the patients, and nobody else. I waited 20 more minutes after the last footsteps passed my door. Then I opened my eyes. The ceiling was the same pale institutional yellow it had been behind my eyelids for 4 days. The room was dim, one light on above the small sink, the hallway light coming in under the door in a thin strip. The monitor beside me drew its lines quietly. The chair where Amari always sat was empty. I looked at the room the way you look at something you have only ever felt before and are now seeing for the first time. The IV line. The call button coiled on the rail. The get well card Tony had taped to the wall where I could see it from the bed. Where I could have seen it from the bed. If I had been the kind of woman who woke up and stayed woken. I looked at my wrist. They had set it and splinted it and wrapped it in the clean, efficient way of people who repair things without needing to know how they broke. I looked at the angle of it against the blanket, and I let myself feel for one full moment what it meant that someone had decided this was an acceptable thing to do to a 63-year-old woman walking home from prayer meeting. I felt something finalize inside me. Not harden. I had been hardening since Damien said silver sedan. This was different. This was the closing of a door that would not reopen. Whatever version of me had been willing to wait, to be careful, to give people the benefit of a doubt they had already spent. She finished her work in that moment and stepped aside. I reached for my phone. It was on the tray table to my right, where Tony always left it before he went home. Close enough that I could reach it without sitting up, without triggering the monitor in any way that would bring the night nurse running. I had measured that reach in my mind for 2 days. My good hand covered the distance without difficulty. I found her name. Olivia Brightwell, my younger sister by 4 years, 26 years as a senior claims investigator before she retired, a woman who knows how paper trails survive the people who think they buried them. I had not called her yet because I had not been ready. Because ready means you have decided it is real and you are not going back. I was ready. She answered on the second ring. I had known she would. Olivia has been sleeping with her phone on the pillow since I did not come home on Tuesday evening. She had not called me because she knew me well enough to know that if I had not reached out, there was a reason I had not reached out. She had been waiting for me to tell her it was time. I said 4 words. "It's time. Come now." She said, "I'm already packed." The call ended at 9:17. 51 seconds total. I set the phone back on the tray table. I closed my eyes. And somewhere in the space between one breath and the next, the smallest possible smile arrived on my face. Real, private, gone before the night nurse's footsteps reached my door. Nerissa Brightwell had been lying in that bed for 4 days receiving information. She was done receiving. I was not there when Olivia came into Atlanta, but I know exactly how she did it. She would have driven herself. No flight, no record, no name on a manifest connecting her arrival to any particular date. She would have taken surface roads for the last 40 minutes rather than the interstate, the way she always does in an unfamiliar city, building her geography from the ground up rather than descending into it from above. She would have been wearing something unremarkable. She would have had coffee in the cup holder and her phone face down on the passenger seat, because Olivia does not look at her phone while she is moving toward something. She would have arrived at my house at a time she chose, not a time anyone suggested. Tony had left a key under the back porch planter 3 days after my call. I had written him the instruction on his palm the night I made contact. A single word: key. He had understood without asking where. He knows my house the way he knows his own. I imagined Olivia walking through my back door, setting her bag down without looking around sentimentally, moving directly to the back room where I keep the desk and the filing cabinet and the window that faces the yard rather than the street. I imagined her opening her laptop before she took her coat off. 26 years of knowing where to look means you do not waste time orienting yourself. You simply begin. That evening, Tony came to the hospital alone. I knew the moment he walked in that something had shifted, not his grief. That was still present, still real, still carried in his shoulders and around his eyes. But underneath it, threaded through it, something new had taken up residence, a quality of attention that had not been there before. He sat in Amari's chair and he held my hand, and he talked to me the way he always talked to me in that room, gently, steadily, for the benefit of anyone who might pass the door. When the hallway outside went quiet, I moved my finger. The palm writing system is something Tony and I developed 11 years earlier during a difficult period in our family. There were meetings and conversations where speaking openly created more problems than it solved. We needed a way to communicate without attracting attention. What began as a practical solution became a habit we never completely lost. I traced letters onto his palm with my index finger, slowly and evenly, one letter at a time. He reads by feel and by knowing me, by knowing the particular way I form a capital O, the way I pause between words, the rhythm of my hand that is as familiar to him as my voice. I wrote, "Olivia is there. She has started." His hand stayed completely still under mine. He did not change his expression. He kept his eyes forward the way I had taught him to keep his eyes forward years ago when reacting too quickly could create problems neither of us wanted. Then he wrote back on my palm with his own finger, slowly, "Good." One word, 4 letters. The full weight of a man who has been grieving in a room with people he cannot trust, and has just been handed the first solid ground he has stood on since Tuesday evening. I wrote him 3 more things before the nurse's footsteps came down the hallway. Instructions. Specific. Sequenced. Nothing he needed to question. His finger pressed once against my palm when I finished. Not a letter, just a press. Acknowledgement. Alignment. He stayed another 20 minutes, then kissed my forehead and said goodnight to the room, the way he always did. After he left, I lay in the dark and felt something I had not felt since I woke up in this bed. The weight was no longer only mine. Tony came in the next morning carrying something in his face that had not been there the night before. Not grief. Not the exhausted performance of a man holding himself together in public. Something quieter and more alert. The particular expression of a person who has received preliminary information and is now waiting for the rest of it. Olivia had reached him somehow between last night and this morning. Not with details. She would not have given him details yet, that was not how she worked, but enough. Enough for him to walk into this room looking like a man who had begun to understand that the ground beneath this situation was not what anyone had told him it was. He sat down. He took my hand. And I told him. Not with words. With my finger moving across his palm, slow and even. one letter at a time. And what I gave him was not a summary or a report. It was the full weight of what I had spent 4 months building, while everyone around me believed I was simply a grandmother who had noticed something troubling and didn't know what to do with it. I want to tell you what it felt like to finally tell my son the truth. It felt like setting down something I had been carrying alone through every room I had entered for 4 months. It felt like the specific relief of a woman who has been precise and careful and completely solitary in her work and is finally allowed to say, "Here, this is what I did. This is what it means. This is why we are not as broken as they believe we are." It felt like love expressed in the only language that was safe to use. I told him about the photographs first, not snapshots, documented images with dates and locations embedded, a visual timeline of Berlinda and Damien's movements across 6 weeks. Not proof of everything, but enough to establish patterns that deserved explaining. I had been careful. I had been methodical. I had built the kind of record that did not depend entirely on memory. It simply showed what I had seen. I told him about the written timeline, names, dates, specific observations logged with the precision of a woman who spent 31 years teaching children that details matter because details are what the truth is actually made of. Then I told him about the envelope. I started building it the day I realized I might not get the luxury of finishing what I had started. Fear can make people reckless. It can also make them prepared. I had carried it to an attorney's office the morning I was hit, a woman named Cecile Marsh, whose name appeared nowhere in my life that Berlinda or Damien could trace. I had found her 3 months prior through a colleague in a city they had no connection to. The envelope contained everything I had gathered up to that point. The photographs, the timeline, a signed statement in my handwriting laying out exactly what I had documented, what I had observed, and what concerns those observations had created. Cecile Marsh had instructions. If Nerissa Brightwell did not contact her within 30 days, she was to review what she held and take whatever steps the situation reasonably required. The accident had not stopped anything. It had arrived 4 months too late. I felt Tony's hand go completely still under mine while I was writing. Not pulling away, going still the way a person does when something is reorganizing itself inside them and the body pauses to let it happen. When I finished, he did not write back immediately. Then his finger moved, slowly, 3 words across my palm. "You planned this, not a question, not accusation, pure recognition." The particular awe of a child understanding for the first time that his mother was always operating at a level he had not fully seen. I pressed his hand once. Yes. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he wrote 4 more words, and the feeling in his finger when he wrote them was different from anything I had felt from him in that room. Tony came in the following afternoon with Olivia's report folded inside the front pocket of his jacket. Not printed, handwritten, in Olivia's compressed, precise cursive that I have been reading since we were girls sharing a bedroom in our mother's house. Tony had transcribed it from whatever she had sent him in his own hand onto 3 pages of notebook paper that he slid under his jacket before he left the house. Nothing digital. Nothing that moved through a system that could be accessed by someone looking for it. Olivia had taught him that in one phone call. He sat down. He held the paper below the bed rail where only I could have seen it if my eyes were open. He read it to me in a voice pitched just above silence, his lips barely moving, his body carrying the posture of a man speaking quietly to his unconscious mother about ordinary things. I lay still, and I listened to everything. Damien Covington was not from Atlanta originally. He had come up from a mid-sized city in Mississippi 7 years prior, not fleeing anything that had been formally documented, but leaving behind a collection of records that Olivia had located inside 2 days of looking. A former business partner, civil disputes, insurance claims, property records that raised questions once they were placed beside one another. No criminal charges. No document that said, in plain language, this is what happened. Only fragments. But fragments matter when enough of them point in the same direction. One former business partner had emerged from an 18-month arrangement, significantly worse off financially than when it began. A woman connected to that situation had become estranged from several members of her family during the same period. None of it proved wrongdoing. None of it proved intent. But it was enough to make Olivia keep digging. I lay in that bed and felt the pieces of the last 2 years rearranging themselves around that information. There were things about Damien I had sensed and could never name. The way he spoke about money with a fluency that had no corresponding history to justify it. The way he had arrived in Berlinda's life with a completeness that felt rehearsed. The right references, the right manner, the right amount of apparent vulnerability to make a woman feel she had found someone rather than been found. I had noticed all of it. I had not known what to do with the noticing. Olivia had not given it a conclusion. She had given it a direction. And sometimes direction is more valuable than certainty. Then Tony read me the part about Berlinda. She did not know everything. Olivia was careful about that conclusion, not because she felt sympathy for Berlinda, but because the information pointed that way. Berlinda believed she was making decisions. She believed she had identified Damien's usefulness. She believed she was directing the arrangement. She believed she understood the full shape of whatever they had built together. The records Olivia found suggested something more complicated. Not proof, not certainty. A possibility. A possibility supported by timing, by financial movements, by the sequence in which people appeared and disappeared from Damien's life, and by the fact that several decisions Berlinda seemed to think were hers had produced outcomes that benefited Damien far more than they benefited anyone else. That alone did not prove manipulation, but it raised questions. Questions Olivia considered worth asking. One record in particular stood out. A property dispute from Damien's Mississippi years. The filings themselves were ordinary enough. What wasn't ordinary was the sequence surrounding them. A business relationship deteriorated. Financial pressure appeared. Personal relationships fractured. Then Damien exited the situation while other people dealt with the consequences that remained behind. None of that established wrongdoing. It established a pattern. And patterns matter, especially when they begin appearing in more than one place. I lay in that bed and considered the possibility that Berlinda had spent months believing she was the person steering events, while never asking herself who benefited most from the direction they were moving. Not because she was innocent. Far from it. Because people can participate in something dangerous without understanding every part of what they are participating in. That realization settled differently than the others. Not with pity. I could not afford pity, and Berlinda had not earned it. But with the understanding that the woman I had been watching perform grief beside my hospital bed might not be the architect of what had happened to me. She might be a participant. And participants are often more confident than architects because they mistake proximity for control. I thought about that for a long moment. Then I thought about Damien, about how calm he had been, about how quickly he adjusted to every situation, about the things I had noticed over the last 2 years and never fully understood. Olivia had not given me a conclusion. She had given me a direction. And direction, in the hands of the right person, eventually leads somewhere. Tony refolded the pages. Then he wrote on my palm, 4 words, slow and deliberate. That evening, Tony came alone, and he came with something to say. I felt it the moment he sat down. Not the weight of new information received from outside. Something different. Something internal. The particular quality of a person who has been carrying their own knowledge in silence and has finally reached the point where the carrying requires more effort than the telling. He took my hand. But this time, he moved first. His finger on my palm, slow, deliberate. each letter formed with the care of a man who understood that what he was about to write needed to arrive correctly. I read it, letter by letter. He wrote, "I did things during the 2 weeks. I lay still and I waited." He wrote for 11 minutes. I know the time, because I counted my own. Breaths between letters, the way I had taught myself to measure time in this room without a clock. What arrived in my palm across those 11 minutes rearranged something fundamental about how I understood the situation I was lying in the middle of. Tony had asked me for 2 weeks. I had believed he needed that time to grieve privately, to process what I had shown him, to find his footing before anything moved. That was partially true, but it was not the complete picture. In those 2 weeks, Tony had also been moving. He had consulted a family law attorney, a man named Reginald Osei, whose office was in Decatur, far enough from their neighborhood that Berlinda would have no reason to register his name. Tony had gone once, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon when Berlinda believed he was at his brother's house. He had laid out the marriage's financial architecture and asked specific questions about what could be protected, what documentation needed to be preserved, and what legal options existed if the situation became adversarial. Reginald Osei had told him exactly what he needed to know. The joint investment account was the marriage's single largest liquid asset, built over 14 years of contributions, worth enough that Berlinda had been treating it in her private calculations as her exit resource. The thing she would leave with, the financial floor she was counting on to be there when she was ready to step onto it. Tony had not emptied it. He had not hidden it. What he had done was establish a legal record of its existence, its ownership history, and its movement. While updating beneficiary designations and other documents Reginald advised him to review before any formal proceedings began. Quietly, legally, the week before, I was hit. He had said nothing to me because he had not wanted to compromise what I was building with what he was building. 2 separate, careful structures, neither one fully aware of the other, both aimed at protecting the same future. I lay in that hospital bed, and I felt something that was not surprise. It was recognition. I raised this man. I taught him how to read, and how to hold a pencil, and how to tell the difference between a person who loves you and a person who is using the appearance of love as a management tool. I should not have been surprised that when the moment came, he met it with the same quiet precision that I had spent 63 years practicing. He was my son. Of course he moved. When he finished writing, he held my hand without adding anything. The room was completely quiet. 2 people in a hospital room that had been designed to hold grief, using it instead as the place where they had finally, completely, understood each other. They had struck at both of us. They had been too late for both of us. His finger moved one final time. Tony came the next morning with Olivia's full layout in his inside jacket pocket. 3 pages again. Same handwriting. Same compression of language that my sister has used her entire adult life. No wasted words. No decorative sentences. Every line doing exactly one job and doing it completely. Tony read it to me the same way he had read the last report. Lips barely moving. Voice pitched below the room's ambient sound, body carrying the appearance of a son sitting quietly beside his mother's bed. I received it the way I receive things that matter, without moving, without reacting, letting it settle into the correct place before I decided what it meant. Olivia had identified 3 tracks. The first was civil personal injury liability. This was the most direct. A line drawn from the vehicle used on Cedarwood Lane backward through its procurement, its movement that evening, and the people connected to it. Olivia had located the vehicle. It had been reported stolen 2 days after the accident from a lot in East Point. A report filed by someone whose name appeared elsewhere in records Olivia had already uncovered. That fact alone proved nothing. People cross paths with one another every day. But it was enough to justify looking harder. The evidentiary chain was not complete yet. Important pieces were still missing. Olivia was explicit about that. What she believed was not that she had solved it. What she believed was that the trail had not gone cold. The second track was matrimonial asset protection. Tony had already done the foundational work, Reginald Osie's guidance, the documentation, the legal preparations that had happened below Berlinda's awareness during the 2 weeks she believed were going in her favor. What Olivia had added was the documentation of Berlinda's own financial movements over the preceding 6 months, withdrawals, transfers, a pattern of quiet repositioning that suggested a woman preparing for a future different from the one she was publicly describing. None of it was dramatic. Most important records never are. But that documentation, placed beside Tony's own records, created questions no family court would ignore. The third track was pattern exposure. This was Olivia's sharpest instrument and the one she had been building the longest. Not proof, not a verdict, a pattern. Damien's history across 2 states, the former business partner, the civil disputes, the records that raised questions when viewed individually and even more questions when viewed together. Information delivered to the people most likely to recognize its significance, not to convince them, simply to make sure they possessed information they had not possessed before. 3 tracks, 3 sources of pressure, and Olivia believed they had to move within the same window. Her reasoning was precise. Give Damien only one problem and he would focus all of his energy on solving it. Give Berlinda only one problem and she would do the same. But pressure arriving from several directions at once forces people to make choices. It forces priorities. It forces people to reveal what matters most to them. And sometimes those choices create evidence. Tony paused while reading, then continued. Olivia did not believe simultaneous pressure guaranteed success. In fact, she wrote the opposite. People under pressure sometimes become more careful. Sometimes they become unpredictable. Sometimes they disappear entirely. There were risks attached to every track she had identified. What she believed was not that pressure guaranteed results. She believed it created opportunity. That was a different thing entirely. Tony folded the pages. He took my hand. I lay in the dark of that hospital room and understood something with a clarity I had not felt since before Tuesday evening. For the first time since I opened my eyes, we were no longer reacting. We were moving. The outcome had not been written. There were still too many people making too many choices for certainty to exist. But for the first time, the choices no longer belonged entirely to Damien and Berlinda. Tony squeezed my hand once. The balance had shifted. And somewhere outside that hospital room, people who believed they controlled the board were about to discover they were no longer the only ones making moves. His finger moved once on my palm. I came home on a Wednesday morning. Tony drove me. Amari sat in the back seat and held my good hand the entire way without being asked, his thumb moving across my knuckles in the same steady rhythm he had used in the hospital room. The gesture so familiar by now that it felt like a language we had developed between us without deciding to. The neighborhood saw exactly what it expected to see. Mrs. Fontaine came to her porch when Tony pulled into the driveway. 2 women from the church auxiliary were already on their way up the front walk with food containers before we reached the door. I moved carefully, visibly, in the way of a woman whose body was still making its calculations about what it could and couldn't do. The splinted wrist, the careful breath around the healing ribs, all of it real, all of it visible, all of it the complete picture as far as anyone watching was concerned. Inside, I was completely operational. Olivia was in the back room. I did not go to her immediately. The church women came in and stayed 40 minutes, and I received their concern with the full warmth it deserved. After they left, Tony settled Amari in front of the television and came to find me in the kitchen. He put a glass of water on the counter in front of me and said, without looking up, It went to the right address this morning. Track 1 had activated. A civil legal notice. The beginning of the personal injury liability process. Olivia's first document moving through the correct channel toward the correct destination. Not dramatic. Not visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. A piece of paper arriving where it needed to arrive, carrying Damien Covington's name at the end of a chain he believed was buried. Berlinda arrived that afternoon. She came with flowers. The kind you buy when you need to be holding something when you walk through a door. She hugged me carefully, accounting for the wrist, and said the things a concerned friend says when visiting someone who has been hurt. Her words were correct. Her face was working too hard. I watched her eyes move. She was reading the room the way a person reads a room when they are frightened and cannot show it, taking inventory without appearing to, checking surfaces and expressions, and the quality of the atmosphere for anything that told her whether what she feared had begun yet. She looked at the kitchen doorway. She looked at the hallway toward the back of the house. She looked at me. I gave her nothing. Warm, unhurried, the complete picture of a woman focused entirely on her own recovery, grateful for the visit, untroubled by anything beyond the ordinary work of healing. I asked about her week. I accepted the flowers. I offered her tea with the ease of a woman whose mind was entirely on tea. She stayed 40 minutes. She left tighter than she arrived. I watched her from the front window, the way she walked to her car, the slight deliberateness of each movement, the way she held her keys before she unlocked the door. A person carrying new weight distributes it differently. The body always tells the truth, even when the face has been trained to lie. I knew exactly what she was feeling in that moment. I had felt it myself once, years ago, in a different situation, when I first understood that something I had believed was solid had already shifted beneath me without my knowledge. That particular cold that starts in the chest and moves outward. The recalculation that happens faster than thought. She was feeling it now. She pulled out of the driveway without looking back at the house. Damien did not yet know what was already moving toward him, but he was about to. I was sitting in my living room when it began. Thursday was one day away. Track 3 had its own timeline. Olivia had sequenced it to move the evening before, giving the professional network overnight to process what it received before the morning brought everything else down simultaneously. I knew the hour she had chosen. I knew the channel she had used. I sat in my chair by the front window with tea I had made more for the warmth of the cup than the taste of what was in it. Olivia had sent the documentation to 7 people, not randomly, carefully. The chair of the Community Development Board that had given Damien his most visible platform. The director of the professional association through which he had built his network of referrals and endorsements. 2 colleagues from the Mississippi period whose names appeared in the civil record and who had, according to Olivia's research, relocated to Georgia in the years since. The attorney representing the previous family in Mississippi. And 2 members of Damien's current church. Because Olivia understood, the way a woman who has spent 26 years following paper trails understands, that professional standing can survive a legal notice. It struggles to survive questions asked by people who know you personally. I sat with my tea and thought about the moment each of those 7 people opened what Olivia had sent them. The documentation was sourced. Every claim had a corresponding record. There was nothing in it that asked anyone to believe Olivia's word. It only asked them to read what already existed and decide whether it deserved a closer look. Not everyone would react the same way. One recipient might dismiss it immediately. Another might decide it sounded like an old dispute that had nothing to do with them. But Olivia had never built her work around unanimous agreement. She built it around the reality that when enough credible people start asking the same question, the question develops a life of its own. At 8:52, my phone rang. "Tony," I answered. "Something happened," he said. His voice carried that particular alertness of a man reporting facts before deciding what they mean. One of Damien's board meetings scheduled for Thursday morning had been postponed without explanation. The notification had gone out less than an hour earlier. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was unrelated. But timing matters, especially when timing begins to stack. At 9:26, my phone buzzed again. A text from Olivia. 3 words. He's asking questions, nothing more. No speculation, no conclusions, just information. I sat back in my chair. That was enough. It meant the material had reached someone who mattered. It meant conversations were already happening. The previous family's existence was the detail that could not be dismissed. A man makes a mistake once. A man finds himself connected to remarkably similar allegations in 2 different states over a span of years, and people begin looking harder. That distinction travels fast among people who trusted someone. By 10 o'clock, another message arrived from Olivia. Short calls, lots of them. I could picture it. Not the details, the pattern. A man moving quickly through his contacts, trying to understand what had changed, trying to determine who knew what, trying to locate the source, and finding less certainty than he expected. By 10:30, he called Berlinda. I did not hear that conversation. I did not need to. For the first time, neither of them possessed information the other could use to solve the problem. The first fracture. The first moment the alliance became a liability rather than a shelter. I set my cup down. Tomorrow, everything would move another step forward. And for the first time, Damien and Berlinda would understand that they were no longer the only people looking at the board. Thursday began the way consequential days always begin. Quietly, without announcement. The sun came up over Cedarwood Lane the same way it always did. And the birds were in the oak tree the same way they always were. And Mrs. Fontaine's porch light clicked off at its usual time. The ordinary world had no idea what was moving through it. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. I placed both hands around the cup the way I had placed both hands around the cup the morning of the wedding. Steadily, without hurry, giving the day the full weight of my attention. I was ready. At 8:41, Tony texted one word: moving. Reginald Osei had filed the matrimonial proceedings at 8:30 when the Fulton County Courthouse opened. The filing was clean, complete, and built on 14 years of financial documentation that told the story of a marriage from the inside out, including 6 months of Berlinda's own preparatory withdrawals that she had not known anyone was watching her make. At 9:14, another text arrived. She knows. Nothing more. I did not need more. Berlinda's attorney had reached her. Tony only knew because she had already left 2 messages he did not immediately return. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about the moment she began to understand that the investment account, the floor she had been counting on, the number she had been carrying in her private calculations for months, was no longer the certainty she believed it to be. Protected, documented, subject now to a process much larger than whatever private plans she had been making. The civil liability filing entered public record before noon. Not a private notice this time, public record. Searchable. Damien Covington's name appearing at the end of an evidentiary chain that investigators and attorneys would now have to examine. It was not a verdict. It was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of a process. But beginnings matter. Once something enters the record, it acquires a life of its own. At 12:17, my phone rang. Olivia. I answered on the second ring. She said 2 words. It's moving. Then, after a brief pause, she added, 1, resignation. I waited. A board member, she said, not Damien, someone who doesn't want to be standing too close to the questions. That was all. The call lasted less than 15 seconds. I sat looking out the window after it ended. Not because a resignation proved anything. It didn't. But it proved something else. People were paying attention. Sometime that afternoon, the previous family's attorney made public contact. A statement. Brief, careful, sourced. The language of a legal professional who understood the difference between allegation and proof and stayed firmly on the correct side of that line. It referenced both jurisdictions. It referenced the timeline. It confirmed that additional information had surfaced that warranted renewed attention. The effect was not explosive. It was slower than that. Phone calls, questions, conversations that had previously ended with certainty now, ending with uncertainty instead. People who had never compared notes beginning to compare them. People who had never looked twice at old records deciding they wanted to look once more. By late afternoon, Damien was no longer dealing with a single problem. He was dealing with attention, and attention is difficult to control once it starts moving in the wrong direction. That evening, Tony came for dinner. He and Amari both. Amari sitting close to me at the table, the way he always sat now, his shoulder occasionally touching mine. After dinner, when Amari was in the other room, Tony told me about Vanetta. Vanetta Shipley. My neighbor 3 houses down, a woman I had known for 16 years. She had stopped him on the sidewalk that afternoon. Not because she knew every detail. She didn't. Very few people did. But word had begun moving through the community. Questions had begun moving with it. Tony said her eyes were wet. Not performing shock. Not looking for gossip. Simply saddened that a family she had watched for years was now standing in the middle of something painful and public. The community had started to see it. And once people start looking closely, they rarely go back to looking away. I sat with that for a long moment. Then Tony looked at me across the table. She asked where you were, he said. I told her Tuesday. Same as always. 3 weeks after Thursday, I got dressed for prayer meeting. Not with difficulty. Not with the careful deliberateness of a woman still negotiating with her own body. I got dressed the way I had gotten dressed every Tuesday evening for 11 years. Deliberately, yes. But with the particular ease of a routine that belongs to you so completely, it requires no thought. The navy dress, the low shoes, the cardigan, because April evenings in Atlanta still carry a coolness that catches you if you don't prepare for it. I stood at the mirror and looked at myself for a moment. The wrist was out of the splint. The ribs had finished their quiet work of knitting themselves back together. The face, looking back at me, was the face of a woman who had been through something and had not been diminished by it, which is a different thing entirely from a face that shows no evidence of what it has carried. Earlier that afternoon, Olivia had called. The conversation lasted less than a minute. The civil case was moving forward. The vehicle trail had survived every attempt to blur it. Additional records had been requested. Additional interviews had been scheduled. Nothing was finished, but nothing had disappeared either. As for Berlinda, the matrimonial proceedings were advancing exactly the way Reginald Osei believed they would. The financial questions were now official questions. Questions that came with deadlines and documentation requirements and consequences for incomplete answers. The process was doing what processes are supposed to do. Moving. I set the phone down after that call and felt something leave me. Not relief. Something quieter than relief. The understanding that I no longer needed to carry every piece of it myself. I picked up my Bible. I went out the front door. Cedarwood Lane was doing what it always does on a Tuesday evening in spring. Mrs. Fontaine's porch light already on, even though the sun hadn't fully gone. The Delacroix bicycles in their perpetual sideways position on the lawn. The oak tree with its anonymous initials catching the last of the afternoon light the way it had been catching it since before I moved to this street. I walked. The evening air had that quality it gets in late April. Warm underneath with a thread of cool running through it. The kind of air that reminds you that the season is still making up its mind. I passed the Delacroix house. I passed the gap between the two properties where the streetlight takes a moment to find you, and the shadows run briefly together. Then I reached the spot. There is no marker there. No physical evidence that anything happened on that particular section of pavement. The street looks exactly as it has always looked. Ordinary, familiar, completely unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know what it tried to be on a Tuesday evening 3 months ago. I did not pause. I did not slow my step or shift my weight or give that piece of pavement a single thing it had not earned. I walked through it the way you walk through a space that once held power over you and no longer does. Not with performance, not with defiance, simply with the steady forward motion of a woman who has somewhere to be and every intention of getting there. The church was warm and full of the particular sound of people who have known each other long enough that their voices have learned each other's rhythms. Sister Odessa wanted an extra chorus. Nobody told her no. I sang every word. The walk home was the walk home. Mine. Completely and permanently mine. Tony called when I was half a block from the house. He and Amari were confirming Sunday dinner. What time, what I wanted him to bring. I told him 6 o'clock and to bring the cornbread because his was better than mine and we both knew it. He laughed in the way he laughs when something is genuinely easy between us. Then Amari got on. He asked me, his voice still carrying that particular careful quality he had developed over the last 3 months, the one that listened for more than the answer. He asked if I was okay. I stopped walking for a moment, just one moment, standing on Cedarwood Lane in the evening air with my Bible under my arm and the light coming through the oak leaves the way it always had. I have never been better, I told him. I meant it with every part of myself that was still standing. I walked through my front door and closed it behind me. They thought they could stop me on this street. All they did was show me how far I'd already come.